Europe has clearly taken the lead in building regulatory frameworks to deal with technology competition policy, data privacy, and also tech avoidance by some of the big, or tax avoidance by some of the big tech companies. Here to share their insights on where that framework is headed, please welcome Marie-Laure Denis, Helen Dixon, Ulrich Kelber with Fortune's Adam Lashinsky.
Thank you, Alan, and good morning, everyone. Well, we have 3 commissioners, 3 regulators. If you see CEOs of tech companies leaving the room, you won't be offended by that. Commissioner Denis, I'd like to start with you as we are your guests. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'd like each of you to briefly summarize the data protection policies and regulations as an update in your countries. So if you would start, please.
So thank you very much. In France, we want that people be more and more aware about data protection, and we see it is the case. For example, at the French Data Protection Authority, the CNIL, there have been more and more complaints. 1 year after GDPR, there has been 42% of increase of complaints, and for example, 80% more of people going on our website, to up to 8 million people a year to see what are their rights. So I think there is more and more awareness, and our job is to facilitate the transition of companies, of organizations to GDPR, and to do that we try to offer them tools, guides, for example, specific guides for SMEs, specific guides for public local organizations, and so we have also sectorial compliance to try to help the firms, and of course, accountability, which is one of the main concepts of GDPR, has to also be in balance with enforcement. And so we are, of course, treating all the complaints we have, and we have seen also a huge rise of complaints, more 40% in France to the CNIL in the year following the GDPR. So accompanying the firms and enforcement are our 2 main actions, of course, also with our international and European friends.
Commissioner Dixon, you were the subject of a story in Fortune recently, which we all enjoyed. Ireland has an important and unique position as far as Silicon Valley is concerned. Could you give us an update from your perspective, please?
Yeah, I think, Adam, it wouldn't be an overstatement to say that the GDPR has been a major phenomenon in Ireland since it came into force in May 2016 and in the lead up to its application in May 2018. We've seen huge engagement from individuals, members of the public. We've seen significant engagement from the media, both nationally and internationally. And we've had very significant engagement from the SMEs in Ireland and, of course, from the Silicon Valley companies that have their main establishments located there. So we often say in Ireland, there's nobody whose granny doesn't talk about the GDPR every day. There's nothing done now without consideration being given as to whether it complies with the GDPR. So a couple of key metrics which probably coincide with those that Marie-Laure just gave. As a data protection authority, we've amicably resolved 6,000 complaints already in 2019 from individuals who've complained about big tech companies, but also about SMEs and public sector data processing in Ireland. We've also had, for the first time in the last 18 months in Ireland, over 1,600 data protection officers appointed. And these are a very important new feature of the GDPR. So these are individuals with expertise in data protection that are now embedded in organizations, including in the big tech companies. And they are the first line of response to individuals. They are the experts within organizations that act as a critical friend to an organization when it's considering a new implementation that involves personal data processing. So it really has been a phenomenon. What we're seeing now, 18 months in, is that there is a need to better support SMEs and smaller organizations in terms of more guidance. There's certainly still an abundance of confusion out there in terms of how to apply the principles proportionately, how to conduct that risk assessment in relation to the personal data processing operations and then apply a proportionate response. So we've seen some over-implementation in some cases.
And so I'm clear, when you talk about these data officers, these are employees, not regulators, is that correct?
They are employees and they're located in the organizations, but they have a very specific status in that an organization can't fire one of these data protection officers for doing their data protection officer role. And they also have an obligation under the GDPR to cooperate with the data protection authorities. So they're an unusual, hybrid, challenging type of role.
And so these are, it's something like compliance officers of a different era, but with different responsibilities and a different legal framework.
I would say so, and a lot more challenges. In fact, that's another thing we've identified, particularly in Ireland, that data protection officers are in some cases struggling to understand their role and where they fit between the data protection authority and the organization that they work for. And we are now, starting in 2020, going to roll out a whole range of supports for data protection officers. We're going to host our first data protection officer conference in Q1 of 2020 and bring in expert data protection officers to try and lend their expertise to others and share their experience.
Thank you. So we'll come up to the European level in a moment, but first let's travel to Germany, please.
Yeah, thank you. So Ireland's the #1 for hotspot for big tech. We are the battleground for transforming former national regulation to the European regime and harmonizing the enforcement of data protection. So Germany has an experienced background for 50 years of regional data protection regulation and more than 40 years on the federal level. And now is doing this transforming into the European regime with a 95% adaptation of the European regulation. There are still some lags in telecommunication sector on that. And what the enforcement and the harmonization means, we not only have one data protection authority, so not only mine at the federal level, but we have 17 in the 16 Bundesländer, that means our states. And we have some specific authorities for broadcasts and churches. So we're not only meeting at the European Data Protection Board, but on a German conference trying to harmonize the enforcement even on the national level to get some, getting less criticism for different enforcements on the same issue.
Let me get the three of you to address what I think is the elephant in the room. There have been a few conversations here that lament the fact that Europe is behind on digital, and yet Europe is ahead on regulating digital. It seems rather obvious to me that there might be a connection there, and I'd like your reaction to that.
Well, it's difficult to react to the elephant in the room, but what I see is that there are bridges because, for example, I went to the States a few months ago and I was very interested by the debate going on about the need or not the need of federal law, for example, on data protection. And as you know, of course, all in the room, there is a Californian law who will be from next January. And so I think these topics are not only a European idea, but I think all over the world is spreading the importance of data protection.
I'll reframe the question is in particular for you, which is I know that one of your planks is to figure out how to regulate while also encouraging industry. Mm-hmm. And would you discuss that a little bit?
Yes, I think, of course, I understand data protection can be more reglementation, tax reglementation, competition reglementation, another reglementation. But I think our idea, and it's the bet of the European authorities, is that it can foster innovation also and economy, because digital economy will not grow from a sustainable point of view if there is no trust. And we see all over the world that trust is the key word for development of digital economy. There have been many scandals about data protection breaches. We see each time we do a control, we see there are breaches, for example, or there are problems, and people are more and more conscious of that. And I think innovation can be compatible with data protection. And I just wanted to, Helen told about the importance of data protection officers. In France also we have now 20,000 data officers that have been appointed in firms for 60,000 firms or organizations, because they can be mutualized. We have done a MOOC also for them to be compliant. And what I wanted to say is that for me, it is very important that data protection and privacy be a matter of discussion in boards of firms, because it's a question of reputation, it's a question of strategy, and because it's difficult also to work together computer scientists, lawyers, juridical specialists, marketing specialists, etc. So it's a question that has been, that there's a need of impulsion from the top of the firm or of the organization if you want privacy to progress. But I think it's a strategic matter for firms, for reputation, and to because the habit consumptions will move to the, and I see that all the big tech, you were talking about elephant in the room, all the big tech now are advertising about campaigns. There's privacy, the word privacy is everywhere. I mean, there's not a box that is being launched without privacy somewhere. So I think it's symbolic.
They're for privacy.
Exactly.
For sure.
I wouldn't agree at all with that argument that innovation in Europe lags behind, in particular because of data protection regulation. I think it's actually the opposite. If you look at the US, there are huge differences in the way venture capital works, in the way entrepreneurship is generated in the US, in terms of the way STEM subjects are taught and encouraged. So there are a whole load of policy initiatives that Europe needs to look at in terms of encouraging innovation. I'd agree entirely with Marie-Laure. Data protection is about engendering trust of citizens or customers, depending on whether public sector or private sector entities. It's simply a framework to allow an organization do something in the right way. It doesn't out and out prohibit anything. There are ways of legitimizing different forms of personal data processing once the interests of the individuals whose data are being processed are protected in the process. So I think there's no basis for such an assertion.
Commissioner Kalber, I'd like you to talk about the approach to regulating the cloud, specifically with regard to the big U.S. cloud companies. A junior French minister referred to Amazon Web Services as a soft drug, which I thought was interesting, because we had the U.S. ambassador to NATO yesterday talking about how the Chinese cannot be trusted. Is there a sense in Europe that the Americans can't be trusted?
Yeah, right. We are dealing a lot with the American big tech companies as individual companies with their cloud services, which are much ahead of European services these days, and even with the privacy shield negotiations and reviews. I think we have to have a look out for other countries, third-party countries, where a lot of data processing with European companies are made in, like China, Indonesia, India, and not only concentrate on the American companies, but to enforce our data protection. Our first duty is to ensure the constitutional rights of individuals on privacy and self-determination, we have to have a look out even on American web services, on cloud services, and especially with regulations like the US Cloud Act, the debate about the an agreement, an umbrella agreement between the European Union and the US about cloud services. We have to have a look out is who can have a grip on that data in such services, which data are collected, because that idea of a data lake, a business case, that's not a European value.
I confess that before preparing for our panel, I did not know about the US Cloud Act. Now I do, but could you briefly tell everybody what it is?
Briefly. The basic idea of that you can have access to data which are stored by companies, even if the physical place of storage is not inside the country itself, that means the US, but even, for example, in the European Union, which is in a kind of rivalry to European regulations of who can have access on data. The European side is planning to have such an act inside Europe too. There is the European Commission wants to have an umbrella agreement with the US to have that kind of exchange access on data, directly access to companies which have data on certain areas in the world on a bilateral on base. And we've decided that there is only a small path for European companies working with processors which are under the US Cloud Act, as long as they have not the real contract about who is in the end accessing that data from official sites, for example.
I'm happy to take your questions whenever we already have, please, right here. Just bring it's coming to you from that direction, sir. Please identify yourself.
Good morning, Gary Shapiro, the Consumer Technology Association. I represent 200 tech companies in the US, so it's not shocking that I have a slightly different view. But could you comment, please, because you were trying to get to it, but I'd like to dig a little deeper. China, and you mentioned some other countries, they have a lot of people. They have a totally different view of privacy. And artificial intelligence data is the fuel that drives it, and AI is where a lot of economic battles will be fought. And while the US is almost certainly aligned with Europe in the respect for the individual and protecting the individual, there is a little more balance in the US in terms of willingness to go forward. And I wish you would talk about how you're going to compete with China in Europe when they have over 1.4 billion people and really no restrictions on data. So could you talk about that just as a competitive, in a competitive stance a little bit more?
Please. Thank you.
I mean, first of all, it's our role as regulators to apply the General Data Protection Regulation. In terms of companies in China that are targeting EU users with their services, that are monitoring EU users, the GDPR applies to those companies. And so in the same way that we implement it in respect of indigenous SMEs and US companies, the law will be applied in relation to those Chinese companies. So take, for example, TikTok and ByteDance. It will establish a presence in Europe, and that presence will then be supervised, and the GDPR will be enforced as against that entity. So it's not that there's any special consideration or exemption for Chinese companies. They will be enforced against in the same way.
Well, yeah, I can rephrase the question, which I think would the three of you make the case that as regulators, it's not your job to be concerned about how Europe competes against China? That's what I'm hearing you say, but I don't want to put words in your mouth.
The one thing is with that marketplace directive, we have access. The practically thing is every time an US company got a fine in, for example, in the past, they reacted on that. What it would be with a Russian, a Chinese, an Indian company in the practical meaning. The idea of competition, in my first profession, I was a computer scientist. And sometimes I hear that debate from my colleagues, telling them we cut them off from innovation, from data. And my answer is yes, there will be some business cases. Cut it off if you see on that constitutional rights of privacy and self-determination. But if you really brings in privacy by design at the very beginning of the development of your services and products, you have less restrictions. And I think that trust will be a currency in digitalization, of people trusting in new services. And companies and products and services coming from an area where the cybersecurity and data protection is done in the right way, in a trusted way, will have a unique selling point on the market worldwide.
I want to come back there, please. Yes?
David Mayer from Fortune. It's interesting what you say about privacy privacy by design. With AI, we are at the very early stages. With what Shoshana Zuboff calls surveillance capitalism, we're not at the early stages. We have a huge trade in data, which happens largely without the subject's knowledge, which is used for behavioral predictions and all sorts of things, and is widely seen as the lifeblood of the free online world. I know that this is actually the subject of live investigations, but is this model compatible with European data protection law, or are we going to see fundamental changes coming very soon?
Thank you, David.
So you're talking, David, about the ad tech model, the online behavioral advertising model. As you mentioned, that model is the subject of a number of different live investigations being conducted by my office. In particular, we've one that's looking at Google's real-time bidding system. We've other investigations that are looking at the various platforms in terms of the identifiers they use, the profiling they're creating of users and how they're targeting users. We've also got an investigation into a data broker, because data brokers feed the ad tech system. The reason we have lots of different investigations open is that, of course, the GDPR is predicated on definitions of controller and processor. So we can't simply say there's an ad tech system, we'll investigate that. We must identify the controllers, we must identify the processors, and we must target the discrete investigations at each and look at the obligations of each. So that's why we've carved it up in that way. So it's probably not possible to say at this point, until we conclude the investigations, add up all of the results together and look back and say, was that model compatible? What has changed? But certainly we're on the job and we're targeting it from lots of different angles in order to answer that very question.
And when we also launched in France, for example, a consultation with the marketing digital sector to help them to be compliant with GDPR, getting consent of the internet users before being targeted. So this is also what we are doing to accompany firms. And as Ulrich Kelber said, I think privacy by design is very interesting, and we can have a different model for artificial intelligence. We also say, for example, well, of course, you need a lot of data to perform in artificial intelligence, but we can say also, be careful, because you have to have a human intervention because they're not always intelligent systems, and you have to keep control. And so we give some guides. For example, at the CNIL, the French Data Protection Authority, we published a report about artificial intelligence and some recommendations to have artificial intelligence, but privacy, how to combine them. So it's also our job to try to accompany firms and organizations on digital marketing, the way of implementing artificial intelligence, and privacy by design is one of the key, of course.
I think there was a question over here, yes? He asked the same question. Is there another? There's a sense that two things. One is that there's a theme out there that Europe is moving too slowly in enforcing its own regulations, that there hasn't been much to show for GDPR, for example. How do you react to that?
Well, the French Data Protection Authority has fined big American tech company last year. So, so far, it's the biggest fine.
This was the 56 million euro fine against Google.
50 million, yes.
50 million. I mean, this is like, you know, this is like them tipping the valet when they park the car for them.
Well, yes, I know when you compare to the fines of the European Commission about competition, for example, I understand. But it's also, it's not only symbolic, because behind of that, we are getting the firms to comply more and more, and also the users to be more aware of their rights and to get to make them exercise them also.
I don't think that's a universally accepted view. If you look at the one-year annual report that the EU Commission published over the summer and the look back that it did on the first year of the GDPR, it found that we are where we expected to be in terms of implementation of this new law. I mentioned earlier, we've amicably resolved as one data protection authority 6,000 individual complaints. We've opened and completed a consultation on children's data and how best to safeguard children's rights under the GDPR. Every data protection authority has taken a lot of positive actions. I think probably the view that you're referencing is specifically in relation to big tech companies and why there haven't been more fines. And I think anyone who understands a little bit about due process and how to conduct an investigation that may give rise to very significant sanctions, not just in terms of massive fines, but in terms of corrective powers that can include halting and banning processing operations, will know that there's a method that has to be followed in order to conduct that investigation. So I think for the data protection authorities, for the most part, they are where they expected to be. If you look back at competition law in Europe, when it was introduced in 1962, I think the first big fines were in 1967 or 1968. You don't create these kinds of outcomes overnight. And the other thing is, thinking back to David Meyer's question from a few moments ago, we're trying to resolve and examine issues that have been around for the longest time in data protection. This whole issue even of the notice and consent model, which most people say is deficient. What is the solution to that? Because it's the starting point, of course, in terms of online behavioral advertising. A cookie is dropped, we get notice, we consent. So what are the solutions to these questions that have been around for a long time? So in conducting the investigations we're doing, in applying the law, we're also trying to be thoughtful in terms of looking at where are we trying to bring this picture.
It needs to be a very quick question, please. Yes, right behind you. Please tell us who you are.
Hi, Judy Hess, Copperleaf. I have a question. We're talking about the age of acceleration here, and things are moving. This is the slowest they're moving, and they're only going to be moving faster. But regulation takes a long time. So how are you going to, by the time you get where you need to be, things will have accelerated in this digital world so fast. So how will you change how you're regulating or adapt to this change when you need to move, when regulation is inherently a slower process?
So there are a number of decisions made on the national level. That's not only for small and medium-sized companies, but even for international companies owning independent national companies. The cross-border decisions are much more complicated, but if they are brought in, they will give a show on the very basic principles of data regulation. And not only the data protection authorities are regulating, but other competent authorities too, like the antitrust authorities and, for example, the first attempt of the German antitrust company showing which kind of data Facebook may collect from different sources than their own services.
So if I could just leave with a very brief takeaway, I have two. One, we need to be patient with Europe, and number two, that Europe will be Europe. And with that, thank you very much to the three of you.
Thank you very much.